We're looking at alternate theories about the resurrection. We've looked at legend. Now we come to our next L, which is liars. Basically, this is that the whole thing was a scam. It was a fraud, that the disciples invented all of this to deceive people. They stole the body. They made up the resurrection appearances. They'd put all their hope in Jesus. They'd followed him for these last 3 years. When he died, they realized they'd made a huge mistake. But then they also realized that if they could invent the resurrection, they could get people still to believe that he was the Messiah. And this is actually the oldest alternate theory about the resurrection. We find it recorded in the Gospels themselves. In Matthew chapter 28, it says, "When the chief priests had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, 'Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep.' So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day." Well, let's examine this plot. And let's first of all consider the planning. There was no belief that the Messiah was going to die, let alone any connection of the belief of resurrection to the Messiah. It was just not part of the Jewish worldview. So if they were going to make anything up, they'd make up that he was exalted, which was what the Jews believed happened to a worthy person. They would make up an exaltation. They wouldn't make up this unusual claim of a resurrection. What about the condition of the disciples? They were broken, they were crushed, they were bewildered and despondent. They had lost all their hope and their faith. And what happened was the last thing that they were expecting to happen. And what were their actions? Well, the men were locked away, cowering because they'd just seen their leader executed. And the women followers were taking spices to the tomb to embalm a corpse. How were they going to get past the Roman guard that had been placed there to prevent the stealing of the body? Were they going to sneak past the Roman guard? Were they going to fight this Roman guard off? And why did they unwrap the body? Remember, all the grave clothes were in the tomb. Why strip the corpse and then carry this gory, naked, decomposing corpse through the streets? And is there any evidence that these men were liars or deceivers? Their writings teach the highest moral standards the world has ever known, and yet that's all based on a lie. The Bible is all about honouring God, and yet they dishonoured him by lying. And this is actually stated in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 15, where it says, "If Jesus is not been raised, we are even found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified about God that he raised Christ." So this theory is that it didn't really happen. None of the things that we're claiming about the resurrection really happened. And yet something dramatic must have happened to turn these cowering, fearful disciples into bold preachers of the resurrection, who no longer feared execution, even after just seeing their leader brutally executed. And what did the disciples gain from this fraud? Did they gain riches or power or influence? They didn't gain any of these things. In fact, they were poor, they were despised, they lost everything, and all they gained was trouble, and lots of it. They were persecuted for claiming that Jesus rose from the dead. They were arrested, they were beaten, they were stoned, they were whipped, and ultimately they were executed for preaching and proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. Now, would you do all of that for a scam? Some people do lay down their lives for something that they hope or believe is going to be true. But people do not give their lives for something that they know is false. Would you die for a lie? And yet none of these eyewitnesses ever recanted their claims that they had seen and spoken with the risen Jesus. So listen to what the Watergate burglar Charles Colson says. He says, Watergate involved a conspiracy to cover up, perpetuated by the closest aides to the President of the United States, the most powerful men in America who were intensely loyal to the President. But one of them, John Dean, testified against Nixon, as he put it, to save his own skin. The real cover-up, the lie, could only be held together for 2 weeks, and then everybody else jumped ship in order to save themselves. Now, the fact is that all that those around the president were facing was embarrassment or maybe prison. Nobody's life was at stake. But what about the disciples? 12 powerless men, peasants really, were facing not just embarrassment or political disgrace, but beatings, stonings, execution. Every single one of the disciples insisted to their dying breaths that they had physically seen Jesus bodily raised from the dead. Don't you think that one of those apostles would have cracked before being beheaded or stoned? That one of them would have made a deal with the authorities? None did. And what about the skeptic James? He had heard all about Jesus' miracles and didn't believe. And now this claim of the most outlandish miracle, that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and suddenly he's going to believe this without proof? He only became a believer after he met the risen Jesus personally himself. And what about the persecutor Paul? He would have believed this stolen body theory. That was the theory that was spread by the Jews. And yet something changed him to the exact opposite view, that Jesus had risen from the dead. Why would he take this dramatic U-turn? Why would he believe this outlandish claim? Well, he says it was after the risen Lord Jesus appeared to him and spoke to him. And how does any of this fit the circumstantial evidence? These dramatic and sudden changes in belief from Judaism to Christianity. The sudden spread of the gospel, even though it was against the worldviews of both the Jewish people and the pagan, the Gentile people at the time. And the sudden fearlessness of Christians in the face of death. We looked at 16 pieces of circumstantial evidence that surround the case, and this theory does not explain any of that circumstantial evidence. Well, what about the idea that someone else stole the body? Maybe grave robbers, and then that duped the disciples into believing that Jesus was risen. Well, this does not explain the facts any better. Why would grave robbers unwrap this gory corpse before carrying it away? And this, in fact, was what the disciples originally thought had happened. In John chapter 20, verse 2, the women who'd been at the tomb say, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." And Mary, thinking that she's seen a gardener, in verse 15 says, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." So this was what the disciples originally believed had happened, that someone else had taken the body. But then, very suddenly, they start believing that Jesus has risen, not because of what's happened to the body, but because they've met the risen Lord. The disciples were not convinced by the empty tomb, but by meeting the risen Jesus. Just think of doubting Thomas. And so this idea that it was all a fraud, that it was all a scam, that the disciples were liars, does not fit any of the facts.